Thanks, John. So just a little more than a decade ago, I had heard from a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He was speaking and he was asked a question about the competitive impact of school choice programs, and he noted that there perhaps wasn't as much response as had hoped for, but the problem was actually that the public schools had to hurt more. In fact, he said they have to hurt. We have to cut to the bone before we can get the public schools to react and change. And this notion is based on economic theory, competitive theory, that school districts would respond. And yet, over the last few decades, the research, empirical research on the competitive effects of school choice programs suggests that public schools often, they can be competitive, but they often lose the most resource-rich families first. And when they lose between 6 and 7% of their market share, they tend to go in a negative spiral. And more recent research in Michigan by Arson and Nee suggests even districts that have lost districts with 20% or more charter schools students, they tend to also perform much lower. But it's part of that competitive response, and it's not, and it's something that's complicated because these school choice policies are coinciding with austerity policies and working to make things substantially worse. Our country is pretty blessed. We have a lot of resources, both human resources and natural resources, and it's kind of strange for me because I've worked a lot in Europe and I've been doing a lot of work in recent years with the OECD, and I've been looking at how Europe and some of the countries are responding to austerity policies. And then I come back to the States and I see how abundantly rich we are, and yet we are struggling so much. And yes, we did have the large economic downturn and near economic collapse in 2008, but since that time there's been an enormous amount of wealth generated. Yet our education systems are yet largely funded at similar levels as at the time of that economic disaster. We're not reinvesting in our human resources in our country. And in fact, we're also getting rid of our natural resources as we peddle them off and through privatization. For my presentation, this introduction today for the panel, I wanted to talk about austerity policies, but what I wanted to focus on was how austerity policies combined with other factors are creating a perfect storm. And I'm going to go through some of those factors, and because I think it's important to look at austerity policies, but also to understand that the hurt on public schools also comes from other sources. And right now we're getting a perfect storm in terms of the alignment of factors that are affecting public schools negatively. It's really critical, I think, for policymakers to recognize this, and I think that I'll make the point that the austerity policies and the combination of these negative factors, it varies by state and it also varies within state. But one of those factors that is complicating the existing austerity policies is school choice programs. They are having a lot of negative impact on public school systems, and I'll talk about those. In Michigan in particular, and I'm not going to talk so much about Detroit because I know Ivy is going to talk about Detroit, but we often talk about, in academic circles, we often talk about Detroit as a poster child of failed school choice. I know just before the DeVos hearings, there were some reports released talking about the Michigan miracle and about the fantastic things going on in Detroit, and but those of us that research these things, those of us that live this, we know that the situation in Michigan is very different than some of those kind of advocacy reports had suggested. But school choice in our country is really hurting public schools, and if we look at our numbers, we're at 3.1 million students in our charter schools. Today, me and my doc students, we do research on charter schools and that privatization aspect. We're doing the 15th edition of EMO profiles, and right now we're looking at half of the nation's public charter school students actually being enrolled in privately owned and operated charter schools. We've reached that tipping point. In Michigan, however, it's 90% of our charter schools are privately owned and operated, mostly by for-profits, about 10 or 11% by nonprofit education management organizations. On top of that, we're seeing schools of choice programs or within district or inter-district school choice programs also undermining public schools, especially urban districts where we're seeing these choice programs as a way for families to flee. And and it's accelerating the segregation by race, class, ability, and language status. And we can see that resulting in Michigan through our Schools of Choice program and interdistrict school choice, and we're also seeing it through charter schools. So it's not just charter schools. On top of this, we have growing voucher and neo-voucher tuition tax credits. We have those things that are blossoming now, also siphoning off a lot of revenues from that would otherwise have been earmarked for education. And finally, we have the new growth of virtual schooling, which is combined in large part with homeschooling and builds on some of that movement, and it's allowing a lot of families to leave and go back and forth between the homeschool sector and the virtual charter school sector. And that's a fascinating sector right now. It's innovative in many ways, but it's totally dominated by these for-profit companies. They don't have any record of evidence that they're able to perform well for the students or as school units. So on top of school choice, what we're seeing in our district schools in the nation as a whole, we're seeing higher concentrations of children with poverty in district schools as a result of these choice programs. We're also seeing higher concentrations of children with disabilities, especially severe and moderate disabilities. In a number of states, we see that charter schools now, on average, with about 10, in some states 11% of their students with disabilities, which is quite an improvement. But when we look at the types of students, the district schools still have the lion's share of those children with severe and moderate disabilities. And that's really making it more difficult in terms of cost to educate those students when there's fewer students, remaining in the district. We're also seeing in our public schools, because of the rise of new charter schools, which are driven by some of these nonprofit EMOs that are no excuses or college prep oriented, we're seeing a much more selective use of selective entry and exit processes in charter schools. That is also that's very different than what we saw 10 years ago, when there were still a lot of independent charter schools who were pretty eager to take any and all students. Today we're seeing that not the case, and we're seeing actually a lot of kids being pushed back after head counts and so forth. So these shifting demographics have been affected by schools of choice and charter schools and other forms of school choice as well. When what we've seen in the Midwest is when things aren't moving along quick enough towards privatization, we have emergency managers. We can bring those in as an austerity measure, and they universally bring in, they privatize, and they take decisions, not very good decisions, but they take decisions to cut cost. We've seen in Michigan some tragic things, of course, in Flint with our emergency managers, but even we don't hear so much about some of our school districts that were contracted out. Emergency managers come in and they contract out the school district to these private providers. So we've seen Muskegon Heights Public Schools go to Leona Group, to Mosaica, and then we saw Highland Park Public Schools being turned over to the Leona Group there. And both of them within a couple of years have failed and collapsed. And perhaps that was part of the intent. But we're seeing that emergency managers also as a factor that's accelerating and worsening some of the conditions already present due to austerity. Overall, the cost of educating our students is going up, especially with our public schools that have more costly to educate students. And at the same time, resources are stagnant for our schools in large part. In many cases, what we see when we do these evaluations of charter school reforms and the impact on local districts is we see limited resources now being split between two failing or struggling school districts or school systems that are very much parallel with very much similar performances when it comes to state accountability measures. And it seems like neither system has the resources or can build the economies of scale to really lift themselves back up. Another factor that complicates all this is healthcare cost. Healthcare costs just keep going up, and it's fascinating when we look at teacher salaries and we compare with the Europeans. And the American politicians are always eager to say, "Look at we spend so much more on teachers and so forth." But most of the industrialized countries they don't pay into healthcare, and that's a large portion of our expenditures on teachers, our benefits in healthcare, and those costs continue to go up. Unfortunately, austerity measures are not as effective at impacting private sector enterprises like our healthcare system, because it's private, and austerity measures tend to target what they can, which are public sector entities. Another factor that complicates this mess, this perfect storm that's building, it's substantial unfunded liabilities, especially in terms of pensions and health care for our retirees. This is something I haven't done a lot of work on in the past. I talked to one of my colleagues who's a former school superintendent, and he just gave me a whole list of publications I had to read from various perspectives, and I was really shocked and saddened to see this situation we're in when it comes to pensions and healthcare obligations to our retirees. And it's very difficult in many of our urban districts as they struggle to not only pay for those fixed costs, but also these liabilities, especially when there's fewer and fewer teachers in the system, in part because charter schools are outside of the state pension systems. There's 26 states that have charter schools in the state pension systems and 16 that do not. And of those 16, only only California and Louisiana are really have most of their charter schools still paying into the system. Other states, including Michigan, the charter schools have become an avenue to opt out of the state pension systems, leaving struggling, a reduced teaching force to be accountable for that burden. So all these things are pretty serious, and a prognosis in the impending threats to public schools. It looks bad, but what I have to say is it looks different from different states' perspectives. And one of those things to understand, we have to understand choice markets, and we also have to understand enrollment trends. And in the upper Midwest and in the Northeast, we've seen in the last, from 2000 until 2014, we saw in Michigan and Maine over 10% drop in population. And we saw that across many of the states in the upper Midwest, similar numbers. The projections for the next 10 years is Michigan could lose another 10% of its primary and secondary school enrollments. This is pretty extreme. At the same time, there are other states like Florida, Texas, Utah, Arizona, and the biggest, Washington, D.C., projected to have very large increases in enrollments. And so when we talk to policymakers and analysts in states like Florida, they often don't see that competitive threat. They often feel that because there's a shortage of spaces already, and charter schools often have different inroads for facilities, that charter schools can take students and they can still fill their classrooms. Where in the upper Midwest, our classrooms are part empty and our schools are half empty, and those are not very efficient to run. So it really depends on the marketplace and how these factors can combine to accelerate and build this perfect storm. But all these factors hurt public schools, and I think it's important to look at austerity policies, but to look at other things. And just in closing, I'd say that, I look at the situation today, and I'm looking forward to hearing Ivy's comments, but in our state of Michigan, there's a lot of speculation that some of the policies are perhaps intentionally designed not so much to hurt public schools, not so much to cut, but to force public school systems to collapse and be replaced by charterized or private systems. And I think that's a great concern of mine, and that can happen where we see this perfect storm forming with the pension obligations, with the increased competition and limited resources that continue to plague our schools. Thanks.
Thank you. Leo, we should hold questions till after all three have spoken, right? Okay. Ivy, let's hear from you.